Dear Visualeconomik community, what I'm about to say, I know, won't come as any surprise. China has become a huge and tough contender for global economic leadership. In the last 3 decades, the Asian giant has undergone a tremendous economic growth process. It has burst like a hurricane into global trade, and this has allowed it to have one of the largest armies in the world, an army with which it aspires to put in check the dominance of the USA. Undoubtedly, China is already one of the most powerful countries in the world. Even so, the truth is that things have not always gone smoothly for the Asian giant. You see, throughout recent history, China has been characterized not for being wealthy and powerful, but for being really miserable. Until not too long ago, China endured continual problems with a lack of political stability, famine, widespread poverty, and, of course, tyrannical dictatorships, capable of annihilating the most basic human freedoms. And do you know what? One of the biggest culprits in all of this was this man. Mao Zedong. Mao was the great dictator of the People's Republic of China during the 20th century, a communist dictator that many classify as the most ruthless, totalitarian, and impoverishing tyrant of all times, even worse than other dictators such as Joseph Stalin or Kim Jong-un. But what do we really know about Mao Zedong? Was he really as terrible a dictator as people say? How did he come to power? And above all, how did he ruin the Chinese economy? Today on Visualeconomik, we will tell you all about it, so stay tuned. What I'm going to tell you now may sound strange, but at the beginning of the 20th century, 40 years before the arrival of the terrible Mao to power, China was on the verge of consolidating itself as the great democratic power of Asia. Yes, that's right. For a while, China was not the dictatorship that we all know. It was a young and promising republic, a country that defended political freedom with periodic elections, bicameral assemblies, and even a constitution that was typical of Western states under the rule of law. China was on its way to becoming what countries like Japan or South Korea are today. However, despite the promising democracy, the Chinese public administrations were plagued by corrupt politicians, with no interest in moving the country forward, and no real capacity to properly control the immense territory that comprised the nation. It was a time when corruption cases, such as fraudulent appointments and political bribery, were on the rise. In fact, political instability ended up being the norm at that time. To give you an idea, the Chinese political climate became so unstable that between 1918 and 1924, in only 5 years, 30 different heads of government and 7 different heads of state were proclaimed. And so, the country ended up dominated by warlords without any democratic guarantee. As you can imagine, China's political chaos, in turn, caused great economic problems. The inequality between the peasants and the elites was enormous. For its part, the government, plagued by corruption in all 4 corners, was unable to move the national economy forward. And to top it off, in 1921, the state declared bankruptcy, a total disaster. Basically, we could say that democratic China, apart from the good intentions, ended up being an absolute political and economic chaos, something that, not surprisingly, resulted in causing a deep malaise in society. Well, it was then that the protagonist of our story, Mao Zedong, began to gain importance. During his youth, Mao was a young man critical of corruption and government mismanagement. In his early years, he became interested in socialism and ended up leading popular movements that made him a true communist role model. Mao and his followers, like good revolutionaries, wanted to rise up against the government and establish a new regime. However, they were not alone. At the same time, there was another large political group that also wanted to overturn the government. That group was known as the Nationalists and was composed mainly of bourgeois and upper-class people. And as strange as it may sound, these two very different groups hated the government so much that they ended up joining forces and started a full-fledged revolution. The revolution against the government was a success. Things were looking very good for Mao and his nationalist allies. They were gaining more and more ground, and the Republican government was in trouble. Yet, in 1927, when the revolution was almost won, something unexpected happened. The leader of the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, betrayed the communists. In fact, Kai-shek ordered the persecution and assassination of the communists in order to keep the power for himself, something he ultimately achieved in 1928. The following years were marked by constant conflicts this, the nationalist leader, Kai-shek, already in power, tried to completely destroy the communists, to the point that he became totally obsessed with taking Mao Zedong's head. But Mao, in one way or another, managed to hide from the nationalist government and to stay alive in the shadows. Even so, the truth is that, at that time, Mao's communist struggle seemed doomed to failure. The nationalists had a great deal of power, and it seemed unrealistic to be able to defeat them. However, in the 1940s, an event occurred that changed everything. Mao Zedong got the economic and military support of an ally that allowed him to put his foot down and reverse the situation. Here, we're talking about Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Just think about it for a moment. The point is, for Stalin, supporting Mao Zedong was a masterstroke. On the one hand, by fomenting a socialist revolution in China, he was able to wipe the nationalist government off the map, which, being made up of bourgeoisie, did not exactly get along well with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, thanks to his support for Mao, Stalin was able to gain control and support of the Chinese government, thus extending socialism throughout Asia. Well, thanks to Soviet support and the popularity of communism amongst Chinese society, in 1949, Mao managed to defeat the nationalists and become the new dictator of China. So now the question is, what did Mao do once he came to power? What were his most significant economic measures? Why is it said that his government condemned the Asian giant to misery and poverty? Well, if you want to know the answers, pay very, very close attention.
Maoist China.
Before talking about Mao's decisions at the head of the government, let's stop and think about one thing. In 1950, China was a super poor economy, and its main sector, as in all poor economies, was agriculture. That is, everywhere in China, the majority of the population were peasants, working from sunrise to sunset on small plots of land. As you can imagine, the living conditions of most of the peasants were very bad, and what is even worse, they did not have the slightest chance of improving their situation in life. So when Mao came to power, his first objective was to improve the lives of the entire Chinese peasantry. Mao wanted the peasants to become the new drivers of his economy. At the same time, this had another great advantage, that being the vast majority of taxpayers were also the peasants. In other words, if Mao managed to increase the country's wealth, he could also collect more taxes. A good old 2 for the price of 1 deal. The question is, what exactly did Mao do to improve the lives of the peasants? Well, he did what socialists do: expropriate land, collectivize it, and murder those who show resistance. Meanwhile, this process had another advantage, and that is that many of the landowners who suffered the expropriations were former nationalist enemies, so taking away their property also served to reduce their ability to exercise political opposition. Beyond that, once Mao expropriated all the land, what he did was to divide it into communes. Basically, these communes were government lands, where the peasants had to go to work. The government decided what crops would be grown, what cultivation techniques were used, the peasants' working hours, and naturally their wages. And as if that were not enough, to guarantee access to the most basic foodstuffs for the entire population, Mao designed a system similar to rationing. That is, the state decided the exact quantities in the workers' diets, fixing food prices at all times. As you can see, there were no companies, no market, and no productive freedom. In Mao's China, the orders of the government were followed to the letter. However, as we've already mentioned, the vast majority of Chinese workers were peasants. And what does that mean? That there was practically no industry in China at that time. So if Mao wanted to develop the country, he had to build factories and achieve much higher levels of production. Of course, Mao was aware of this, and although his priority was to improve the lives of the peasants, there was no way he was going to give up industrializing China. So how did he go about doing it? How did Mao industrialize China? Well, it turns out that Mao's political and economic thinking was heavily influenced by the constant international humiliations to which China had been subjected during the 19th and 20th centuries. We are talking, for example, about the continual attempts of the Japanese Empire to invade Chinese territory. That is why Mao did not want a China that was weak and susceptible to the humiliations of other countries. So, what was the problem? The problem was that the China he found when he came to power was completely shattered by the civil war against the nationalists. Many of the country's major cities were completely razed to the ground, and its army was in tatters. China was anything but strong and capable of resisting international humiliations. Nevertheless, industrialization was a good opportunity to solve this whole issue. In fact, Mao wanted to take advantage of the creation of a new industry to develop a strong arms manufacturing sector for the army. Without a doubt, he also wanted to take advantage of the industrial activity to rebuild the cities razed to the ground during the Civil War. All this was accompanied by a strong investment in chemical, electric, and oil industries. Mao was aiming very high because he believed that only with a powerful industrial sector could he make China stronger than its international enemies. So, as we say around here, no sooner said than done. Mao unleashed a massive industrialization process with results that were quite favorable, quadrupling the production of some industrial goods. What's more, thanks to this enormous industrial effort, over time, China's economic structure changed completely. So while China at the beginning of the 20th century was a land of peasants and eminently rural, after the arrival of Mao, the industrial sector began to occupy the bulk of the economic structure. As you can see, the situation seems to be going very well in the short term. China took its first steps to escape poverty, and the state's investments seems to be paying off. Even so, as you can imagine, problems soon followed. One of the most frightening economic futures in history awaited Mao's communist China. You want to know what happened? What it was that pulled the plug on China's budding economy? Then stick with us.
The Great Leap into the Void.
The nightmare for Chinese society began in 1958. At that time, Mao's government announced a new economic plan, the plan known as the Giant Leap Forward. This plan basically consisted of doubling down on the bet. Mao knew that the industrial plan had worked very well and insisted on producing even more industrial goods, whatever the cost. The thing is, there was one small issue in this whole story. China had a huge problem with materials availability. That is, there were not enough raw materials to achieve Mao's ambitious goals. The government simply could not make ends meet. The industry had grown a lot, yes, but it had grown far beyond its possibilities. For instance, this is something that was very particularly critical with steel. We have said that Mao developed a huge arms industry and that he wanted to rebuild the cities destroyed by the war. The problem is that both of these projects required huge amounts of steel that China neither had nor could produce in the short term. However, Mao did not want to back down. He did not want to cancel his pharaonic industrialization plans, and that is when he made one of his worst mistakes. Mao began to expropriate from his citizens, including peasants, metals that were useful for producing steel. He expropriated necklaces, cutlery, and even tools for tilling the fields, among many other items. Mao's obsession with steel went so far that he even ordered entire houses to be demolished if he could get just a little more steel. But that wasn't even the end of it. Since the metals expropriated from the citizens were of poor quality, and on top of that they were smelted with primitive methods, such as earth furnaces, the resulting steel was of a disastrous quality that in many cases was not really useful when it reached the factories. At the same time, the people who worked in the steel foundries and factories were very poorly educated. During the Giant Leap Forward, Mao mobilized many people from various walks of life, including farmers and workers from different factories, to work in steel production. Yet most of these people had no idea how to produce steel, which made steel production problems even worse. All this resulted in a tremendous mismatch between the government's production targets and actual production. In the end, Mao failed miserably in his production plans, as, for instance, steel production in 1962 was 90% lower than expected. And, Visualeconomik viewers, one of the great problems of planning is that the economy is so complex that it simply is impossible to do it smoothly. However, these problems did not only appear in the industrial sector. Since the Great Leap Forward came into effect, agricultural production also plummeted to levels close to the end of World War II. On the one hand, this was due to the inefficient communal system that was poorly managed by the government, and on the other hand, because of the poor quality of the chemical fertilizers that Mao demanded be used. Another reason was that the steel smelting plants had left many peasants without their work tools. If we add to this an ever-increasing population, then there was simply not enough food for everyone. That is, food rations were increasingly reduced and insufficient. And, not surprisingly, in the rest of the sectors, no news worth mentioning. Most projects in the chemical industry were abandoned for lack of materials. The textile industry also failed to produce the expected results because the garment factory workers were forcibly mobilized and transferred to the steel sector, which was the great national priority. And in the machinery sector, the technology was simply not sufficiently developed. So the very few high-tech machines China had were those that came from the Soviet Union. The outcome, basically, a huge economic setback for the dictator's aspirations. The income and consumption of the peasants. Yes, those those same people who Mao swore to protect barely grew in those years. And some more recent estimates from the University of Pittsburgh states that China's growth rate was 3 times lower than the official one. But undoubtedly, the worst effect of Mao's policies were the huge famines that killed millions of people. To give you an idea, some of the survivors even had to resort to cannibalism to feed themselves. Yet, don't be mistaken for thinking that the government was not aware of all of this. In fact, many of the economists close to Mao realized that the production expectations of Chinese industry were excessive. Raw materials in the Asian giant were in short supply, and importing them from Western capitalist countries did not seem a viable option. As you can imagine, the Chinese dictator did not take kindly to his industrial vision being called into question, and not surprisingly, he was unwilling to rectify it. Mao became obsessed with following the industry's plans to the letter, whatever the cost, no matter how difficult they might be to carry out. But why didn't anyone stop him in time? Didn't anyone advise him to halt his strategy of flight forward? Well, the truth is that criticism was not very well received within the government. Critics of the system were persecuted and accused of being capitalists. In reality, many officials lied to the government by inflating production figures to avoid punishment and even executions. In fact, according to the most pessimistic estimates, the government killed as many as 20 million people during the 1960s in a movement known as the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which victimized at least 1 in every 9 people in the country. So, to sum up, the economy of Mao's government was one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. Millions of people died of starvation, or because of the physical and labor abuses imposed by the government. And it was all caused by terrible economic planning. Planning that, as history has taught us so many times, is economic suicide. Be that as it may, and having reached this point, it is now your turn. What do you think of Mao's economic system? Do you think it would have worked in the future? And does any of this remind you of any similar economic policies in your own country? As always, you can leave your answers down in the comments, and if you liked the video, please like it, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Take care, I'll see you next time.